Hi video makers! In part 2 of my tutorials on size position rotation, I mentioned that I would do a tutorial demonstrating further how to use the combinations of XYZ, and here it is. Why has Magix added in this capability along with movable anchor points, you may ask? With no movable anchor point, all you could do was to rotate the object about the axes running through the center line. With only XYZ, you could only rotate the object about Z, then about the y-axis that is rotated by Z, and then about the x-axis that has been rotated by both y and z. You could not turn the z-axis in a different plane. Now you can. Add in the ability to move the anchor point, and you can do revolutions about the moved anchor point, or rather, you can now do orbits. Here's a simple example. Let's say that you want an object to revolve about something, like the moon with some text, revolving around the Earth. Without these new rotation sequences, all you could do was make a circular rotation in a single plane. You could get an object to rotate about itself, but with the new movable anchor points, you can get an orbit without doing some very laborious keyframing. Depending on the location of the moon and its anchor point, you can use the rotation parameters to rotate the moon about the Earth. You can even get elliptical rotations. As you go through this tutorial, think about the possible uses for your own animations. You'll be wanting to keyframe the movement of objects, most likely for transitions or text. If you're not familiar with keyframing, you should watch my tutorial on keyframing. Let's start with an explanation of the XYZ sequences as given in the manual, which indicates that the set rotations are applied one after the other. The order used can be set in the selection field. This might be necessary in certain situations, for example, if you specify more than one rotation or want to rotate about more than one axis. This is somewhat vague, and we'll see a little bit better the impact of the different sequences of XYZ on the rotations, and hopefully get a reasonable understanding as to how they work. What's happening is not obvious unless you understand how they work. We'll look at the various sequences with the anchor point at the center of the object, then with the anchor point at the mid-left edge, then at the bottom left corner, and finally with the anchor point offset from the object. Before starting, I want to make clear that even though there are 3 dimensions involved, x, y, and z, the objects themselves are not 3-dimensional. You're using a 2-dimensional image or video and modifying its presentation about 3 axes. Here's an example of rotating a 3D object in Bluff Titler. We can rotate about the entire 3D image. However, in Movie Studio and Video Pro X, you can only rotate a 2D image. I have an image on the timeline that I'll use for this demonstration. It's been resized down to 40% so that we see the entire image on the screen during the rotations. The object may be rotated on 3 spatial axes, X, Y, and Z. The anchor point also serves as a center of rotation. The angle of rotation can be adjusted directly by the 3 control elements or entered in the fields using degrees. The orientation of the axis has X as the horizontal axis, Y as the vertical axis, and Z is coming right at you. Since the anchor point is in the center of the object, the X-axis runs through the red handles, the Y-axis through the yellow handles. Rotating X shows that the object rotates about the red points and the red horizontal axis. Rotating Y, the object rotates about the yellow points and the yellow vertical axis. Rotating Z, the object rotates about its center. Here are some general rules. Set the sequence of rotations first. Rotating the 3rd parameter rotates the other 2 axes. Rotating the 2nd parameter rotates the image and the 1st axis such that the 1st axis always stays with the nodes of the object. However, rotating about the 2nd axis does not change the 3rd axis. Rotating the 1st parameter does not change any axis. The image just rotates about the 1st parameter's axis, even if this axis has been moved by the 2nd and 3rd parameters. So, rotating the 1st and 2nd parameters does not affect the 3rd one. This is easy to see when X or Y is the 1st parameter, but more difficult when Z is the 1st parameter. Starting with XYZ, I'll apply a 45-degree angle to Z. This causes the X and Y axes to rotate by 45 degrees. Watch as I rotate Y back and forth. It rotates about the yellow handles and the yellow axis, and it also rotates the X-axis. The red nodes stay with the modified X-axis. Reset Y to 0. As I rotate X back and forth, the object rotates on an axis that runs through the red handles. I'll set X to 45 degrees. If I now go back and rotate Y, the object rotates about the yellow axis, but not the yellow handles, and the X-axis moves with the object. For this case, X will always rotate about the red handles. Note that Z never moved. Let's look at it another way, with no Z rotation. I'll reset X and Y to 0. Now rotate the second parameter, Y, to 45 degrees. Watch what happens when I rotate X. The object rotates about the rotated X-axis, and the yellow nodes move away from the Y-axis. I'll leave X and Y at 45 degrees. If I now go back and change Z, rotating this third parameter will rotate the image and the X and Y axes at the same time. Before switching to YXZ, note that the image lines up with the X-axis. I'll switch to YXZ and the image moves. Note the yellow nodes are lined up with the Y or yellow axis. Rotating Y shows that the object rotates about the axis of the first parameter, which is now Y, but the X and Z axes don't move. I'll reset X and Y to 0. Rotating the third parameter, Z, rotates the image and the X and Y axes. Rotating X rotates the image about the X-axis, and the Y-axis also gets rotated. Rotating about Y just rotates the image about this modified Y-axis. Further rotation of X rotates the image, but not through the red nodes because the Y rotation has moved the object center line away from the X-axis. The Y-axis also gets rotated by X. Any further change of Z rotates both the X and Y axes along with the image. With all three parameters set to 45 degrees, let's jump to ZXY. The image changes again, and now we see that neither the red nor the yellow nodes line up with an axis. Rotating Z shows that the object rotates about the axis of the first parameter, which is now Z, but the X and Y axes don't move. I'll reset everything to 0. Rotating the third parameter, Y, to 45 degrees rotates the image and the X and Y axes. Rotating X rotates the image about the X-axis, and the Z-axis also gets rotated. Rotating about Z rotates the image about this modified Z-axis. Further rotating X rotates the image, but not through the red nodes, because the Z rotation has moved the object center line away from the X-axis. The Z-axis also gets rotated by X. Any further change of Y rotates both the X and Z axes along with the image. Let's look at a case with Z as the second parameter. Changing to XZY, the image changes position, and so do the X and Z axes. The Y-axis doesn't change because it's still the third parameter. Changing X rotates the image about the X-axis, which runs through the center or red handles. I'll reset everything to 0. Rotating the third parameter, Y, to 45 degrees rotates the image and the Z and X axes. Rotating Z rotates the image about the Z-axis, and the X-axis also gets rotated. Rotating about X rotates the image about this modified X-axis. Further rotating Z rotates the image and the X-axis. Any further change of Y rotates both the Z and X axes along with the image. With all at 45 degrees, I'll switch to YZX, thus inverting the positions of X and Y in the sequence. The image changes and the Y and X axes change a lot. The Y axis is now going through the yellow nodes of the object, and moving the Y parameter shows that the object rotates about this modified Y axis. I'll reset everything to 0. Rotating the third parameter, X, to 45 degrees, rotates the image and the Z and Y axes. Rotating Z rotates the image about the Z axis, and the Y axis also gets rotated. Rotating about Y rotates the image about this modified Y axis. Further rotating Z rotates the image and the Y axis. Nothing happens to the X axis. Any further change of X rotates both the Z and Y axes along with the image. It's getting quite difficult to see exactly what's happening since the Y axis is close to the X axis because rotating the image using Z has moved the Y axis around. We've now covered most of the cases except the effect of moving the anchor point. But before moving on, I'll summarize what we've done before. As a general rule, the third parameter should be used first, as it causes the other two axes to rotate. Rotating using the second parameter causes the image to rotate as well as the first axis. Rotating using the first parameter will rotate the image about that axis as modified. Watch as I show each sequence. For XYZ, rotating using Z causes the image and the X and Y axes to rotate. Rotating Y causes the image and the X axis to rotate. Rotating X will rotate the image about the modified X axis, which runs through the red handles. For XZY, rotating using Y causes the image and the X and Z axes to rotate. Rotating Z causes the image and the X axis to rotate. Rotating X will rotate the image about the modified X axis, which runs through the red handles. For YXZ, rotating using Z causes the image and the X and Y axes to rotate. Rotating X causes the image and the Y axis to rotate. Rotating Y will rotate the image about the modified Y axis, which runs through the yellow handles. For YZX, rotating using X causes the image and the Y and Z axes to rotate. Rotating Z causes the image and the Y axis to rotate. Rotating Y will rotate the image about the modified Y axis, which runs through the yellow handles. For ZXY, rotating using Y causes the image and the Z and X axes to rotate. Rotating X causes the image and the Z axis to rotate. Rotating Z will rotate the image about the modified Z axis, which is normal or perpendicular to the image. For ZYX, rotating using X causes the image and the Z and Y axes to rotate. Rotating Y causes the image and the Z axis to rotate. Rotating Z will rotate the image about the modified Z axis, which is normal or perpendicular to the image. Or, the first parameter is always linked to the object axis, no matter what the other two parameters are. I'll move the anchor point to the middle left edge. This moves the Y and Z axes to the left edge of the image, but the X axis still runs through the middle of the object. Start with XYZ. Rotating Z to 45 rotates the X and Y axes. With X equals 0, rotating Y rotates about the Y axis. With Y equals 0, rotating X rotates about the X axis. Making Y equal to 45 degrees changes the X axis. Rotating X rotates about the modified X axis running through the nodes. Any changes to Z will first modify the other two axes, as we've seen all along. With all at 45 degrees, I'll switch to YXZ and the image changes, and the left edge lines up with the Y axis. The axes have not moved, just the image. If I put Y back to 0, the image lines up with the X axis. When I rotate using Y to get back to 45 degrees, the image rotates about the Y axis as modified by the 45 degree rotation of the X axis. If I now modify x, the image rotates about x, and so does the y-axis. Rotating further using y rotates the image about this newly modified y-axis. Yes, it's rather hard to follow if you modify the second parameter after having modified the first parameter. Changing to XZY changes the image and the axes. The y-axis is vertical as it is the third parameter. I'll put z to 0 and the x-axis moves as well. Keep in mind that y is 45 degrees, so both the z and x axes have been rotated, even though it's not obvious. And you can see that the image has been rotated about the x-axis to 45 degrees. As I rotate about z to 45 degrees, the image and the x-axis rotate together. Now, rotating further about x, the image rotates about the x-axis. Nothing happens to the y and z axes. I think you get the picture, or at least I hope you do. Let's see what happens with z up front with ZXY. The image changes dramatically. I'll set all three parameters to 0. Starting with y, I'll rotate the image to 45 degrees, which also rotates the z and x axes. Next, I'll change x to 45 degrees, which rotates the image about the x-axis, and it rotates the z-axis. Rotating about z rotates the image about this modified z-axis without modifying the other two axes. Rotating, using the second parameter, x, rotates the image about x, and it rotates the z-axis. And now with ZYX. Again, the image changes dramatically. I'll reset all three parameters to 0. Starting with x, the third parameter, I'll rotate the image to 45 degrees, which also rotates the z and y axes. Next, I'll change y to 45 degrees, which rotates the image about the y-axis, and it rotates the z-axis. Rotating about z rotates the image about this modified z-axis without modifying the other two axes. Rotating, using the second parameter y, rotates the image about y, and it rotates the z-axis. Let's take a quick look at what happens with the anchor point at the lower left corner and with XYZ. The x-axis has moved to the bottom of the image, and the z-axis is at the lower left corner. I'll rotate the image about z to 45 degrees, and the x and y axes get rotated along with the image. Now I'll rotate y to 45 degrees, and the x-axis moves with the image. Finally, I'll rotate x, and the image rotates about the x-axis, running along the bottom of the image. Going back and changing the third parameter, z, rotates both the x and y axes along with the image. Switch to YXZ, and the image changes dramatically. I'll set everything back to 0. Rotate the image about z to 45 degrees, and the x and y axes get rotated along with the image as before. Now I'll rotate the second parameter, x, to 45 degrees, and the y-axis moves along with the image. Finally, I'll rotate y, and the image rotates about the y-axis, running along the left edge of the image. Going back and changing the third parameter, z, rotates both the x and y axes along with the image. Note that the first parameter, y, is still 45 degrees. Bringing it down to 0 rotates the image about y, and at 0, the bottom of the image is aligned with the x-axis, as it should be. Good. After all that, you should now understand the impact of the sequence of the x, y, and z parameters on the movements of the axes and the image. There is one last trick to learn, and that is with the anchor point away from the object. We saw this at the beginning with the moon orbiting the Earth. With the moon and Earth images appropriately sized, I'll move the moon to the left and then drag the anchor point to the right side of the Earth object. The origin and thus the axes are at the anchor point, of course. With XYZ, moving Z causes the moon object to revolve about its anchor point. If I change to ZXY and move Z, I get the same thing, but the X and Y axes don't change. Back to XYZ. I'll change X to 80 degrees. The object is no longer facing the screen. Moving Z just makes the flattened moon revolve about the Earth as before. But I want a more horizontal orbit. Switch to ZXY, and now moving Z makes the moon object revolve about the Earth, or rather, in front of it. I'll turn off the Earth. The orbit is inclined slightly from the horizontal. Why does it do this? Because when I rotated the X parameter, which is the second parameter, it modifies the axis of the first parameter, the Z axis. I'll put X and Z back to 0. I'll switch to ZYX so that changes to X will modify the Z and Y axes. I'll change X to 80 degrees. Moving Z does the same thing as before. Now watch as I give it some Y. The moon moves to an inclined orbit as I move Z. Without being able to move the anchor point and changing the sequence of XYZ parameters, this type of thing could not easily be done. Okay, I think that we've done enough combinations, and if you're thoroughly confused, experiment with the various combinations and anchor point locations to get a better understanding. Keep in mind the order of the axes and how a rotation of the last two parameters affects the axis of the first parameter. These rotations are most useful with keyframing, so try that out and combine them with the size and position effects. Try them on titles. Just remember to set the sequence of rotations first. In case you were wondering how I got the moon object and text to go behind the Earth image, except for a little bit of transparency towards the end, and then in front of the Earth, leave me a comment. If I receive a dozen requests, I'll do up a short video on how I did this. That's it for now. Thank you for watching. Till next time, enjoy.